All right, let me get to this little deal, because this is something that I think is near and dear to almost everybody. And I don't know how many times we've heard over the past 2.5 years, follow the science. And so that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say follow the science, but don't follow a herd of lemmings. You know what lemmings are, right? They're the little group that just follow each other no matter where they go. And as they go up the cliff, they go one to the next and the next. So the reason that I started to think about this and talk about it was we have a lot of what I call Facebook keyboard commandos, right? And one of them, and I didn't want to mention the person's name, but this came right off of Facebook. And he said, if you're not a scientist and you disagree with scientists about science, it's actually not a disagreement, you're wrong. And I think that's so far afield of what science is all about that this person has no concept of science, because science isn't always right. Any of you ever took an astronomy class? When you take an astronomy class, you'll find there were times when scientists believed the sun revolved around the earth. And when you go through that class, they'll talk about Copernicus, who devised this complex model of what he called epicycles to try to explain the path of the stars through the heavens. Galileo of Galilee was the person who talked about the earth revolving around the sun. And when he did it, they threw him in jail. Well, they didn't really throw him in jail. They put him in house arrest for the rest of his life. And in age 1615, the Roman Inquisition investigated Galileo and said that his theory of heliocentrism was foolish, absurd, and heresy. So here you can see one person confronted all of the experts, and they were right, but not the experts. Medical science is no exception. And all you got to do is look at your history books. George Washington, father of our country. You know what? He ended up getting a really bad cold, and it caused him to have trouble breathing. Today, if you went to the hospital with that condition, they'd probably say you have pneumonia, right? But doctors at the time said, these kind of problems are caused by bad blood, and if we bleed you and get rid of the bad blood, then you'll get better, right? So they bled him 4 times. In the book I read, it was reported that they took out 32 ounces of blood during the last bleeding. And then they had all kinds of other absurd practices at the time, none of which helped him. Through it all, he survived it. He was probably a pretty strong guy. But finally, on December the 14th, between 10 and 11 p.m., George Washington died. And he probably died because of what the doctors did to him. So they're not always right either. A more recent example of this is when I was very young, in the middle to late 40s. Unfortunately, I was born in 1942. And between 1942 and about 1948, 49, I lived in New York. And doctors made house calls. You had the sniffles, and your mother would call a doctor, and he'd come and take a look at you. What do you think he did? He had a wonder drug that was going to cure you. Gave you a shot of penicillin. And in those days, penicillin was so overprescribed, people started having penicillin allergies, and some people died, okay? And I was one of the lucky ones, because the last time I had a shot of penicillin, which was before I was 10 years old, I got a slight rash. They decided never to give it to me again. And to this day, if they ask me, are you allergic to something? I say, I'm allergic to penicillin. So it's not always the fact that everybody that is supposedly an expert has the answer for you. So here again, this guy continued on after his last pearl of wisdom and said, science is not truth. Science is finding the truth. When science changes its opinion, it didn't lie to you, it learned more. Now, the only person that I ever knew that was named it was a television show. And I don't know who it is, and I don't know how science changes an opinion. So science, if you look it up, is a systematic expertise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about everything. So if you have a scientific theory, you test it. And if if the test says yes, it works, then we consider it a scientific observation. But if the test says it doesn't work, it's back to the drawing board. That kind of a concept began in the 16th century when people started changing the idea from traditions, like the sun revolves around the earth, to trying to come up with more valid explanations of what was going on. And in the 19th century is when this really took hold. So who is a scientist? Who is this science, and who is this scientist? A scientist is a person who conducts scientific research to advance the knowledge of an area of interest. So I ask you, if you go out on television today and somebody comes up and says, you should do this, are they necessarily a scientist? I would profess that Dr. Fauci is not a scientist. He doesn't do any scientific research. So I'm trying to figure out what this guy was telling me. And so the idea that someone would be a scientist was coined by this gentleman, William Maxwell, in 1833. Now, I view it more from what I did for a living. I was an engineer. And what's an engineer? So an engineer, according to the definition, is someone who invents, designs, analyzes, builds, tests machines, complex systems, blah, 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 while considering limitations imposed by practicality, regulation, safety, and cost. Now, in reality, what an engineer is it's someone that builds these things out of things that already exist. I wasn't a scientist. I didn't press science. What I did was I took things that people had already developed, and I put them together into a package. That stuff over there would really be called systems engineering. I didn't design any one piece of that, but I took pieces that perform functions, I put them together to accomplish a specific task. And it said the functional qualifications of an engineer may include a 4-year degree or a master's degree. I got both. But I'm not sure that that is totally true. So the reason why I talked about being an engineer is because I wanted to take it into a concept of something that I understood, that I could explain to you that experts are not always right. And I think one of the ones that was probably the most humorous, I hope when I explain this you'll think it's humorous too, was in around 1970. I got this job of putting together or debugging a piece of equipment. I was one of the team that debugged this piece of equipment to test inertial navigation system. And we were just starting to use digital computers. Now, in digital computers, I don't know if any of you have ever counted in binary. I know you count in decimal, right? So if you count in decimal, the figures are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then you move over to the base 10 and you have another digit. In binary, you only have 2. 0, 1, and then you move over to the next. So here it is. I laid out how you count from 1 to 7 because as the registers started to grow and binary numbers started to get bigger, to say 101, 111, 100 didn't mean much to anybody. So we started using octal. So base 8, which means that the numbers that we were using was 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then you transferred over. So if you ever learn to count in binary, that's the way you did it. And so if you looked at this and you realized that binary only had two states, you needed a wire for each state. So in order to represent it, you needed 3 wires plus 1 of ground. And when we gave this design over to the double E's to go and implemented it, they didn't know what octal was. But they were too embarrassed to ask, and so they went and pulled for each octal digit 8 lines, because octal must mean 8, so you must need 8 lines, right? So we had all this extra wire in our equipment for all this stuff, and it was very embarrassing for these guys. We had to go back and say, pull that out of the design. When we have been subjected to the things that we've been told over this time, they talk about models, and models is something that engineers work with all the time. And we normally work with predictive models. So when someone says, well, we've been looking at this and the model says, so what you do is you start with a future prediction based on past performance. You might say, you know what, on this certain day of the year, 50% of the time it rains. So when you come up to that time of the year the next year, you might say, okay, well, let's see what happens. And you record the events as they occur, and then you update your model. So you evaluate your model's predictions against actual events over time, and you update that model as required. I wrote an article about it right at the beginning of this whole thing in the Gazette on the 24th of September in 2020, where I said the dilemma today about COVID models is that somebody doesn't really have any real baseline to work with. Instead, they're making predictions off the cuff, which are initially pessimistic and overblown. So basically, they said, you know what? You're going to die because this is terrible. Things are happening. Oh, look at the amount of deaths that we're getting. But they didn't really know whether that was really true, and no one has ever come back to us and updated the model. So one of the things that we saw right at the beginning was the idea that if you remember when we were going to wear a mask for 6 weeks to flatten the curve, right? I'm not sure that anybody knew what flatten the curve meant. This is a picture that came out of the article that said, look, we're going to flatten the curve. Now, what they did was they predicted the transmission of the disease by the 80-20 rule. You guys know what the 80-20 rule is? Typically, it says that 80% of the work is going to be done by 20% of the people. That's a good way to explain it. And so there is a bell curve that corresponds to that, and that was the bell curve they were talking about, the red line. And they said we're going to all wear these masks and we're going to flatten the curve. What does that mean? Well, it really doesn't mean that you're going to have less predicted people get sick. It really means, and this was a much better representation, it really means that you're stretching out the same number of people getting sick over a longer period of time. One of the things I did when I was teaching in college was I taught algorithms. And this is one of the algorithms that we always talked about, computing the area under the curve. And so instead of thinking that this is going to prevent you from getting the disease, it was only meant to postpone you from getting the disease. And that was their initial thought, and we know now that didn't work either. So they started talking about masks. Now, remember at the beginning they said masks are, only medical professionals need masks. And all of a sudden, everywhere we go now, you go into a store, I don't care where you go, you got to wear a mask, right? Well, there were only 3 kinds of masks at the beginning of this whole thing, and none of them were really produced there for medical purposes. N95 masks were an industrial mask. You used to be able to buy them at Home Depot. You can now again, right? They were masks for people that did a lot of sanding, that generated a lot of small particles to keep it from giving you lung disease. And an N95 mask is supposed to block 95% of the particles that would go through it. But you know what? That wasn't good enough for welders. So they came up with an N100 mask, which no one seems to talk about, they block 97% of the particles. They can't block 100% of the particles, because if they block 100% of the particles, you can't breathe. Okay? And all of a sudden, someone started talking to us about KN masks. And the KN is simply the form and the fit. Then there were clean room masks. I saw those all the time at work. And clean room masks were basically because we didn't want, in our equipment, we didn't want hair, we didn't want moisture, and so they were basically produced to prevent that, but they would not stop things like a viral particle from coming through the mask. And then there were surgical masks. Remember watching MASH? Well, those were the typical old surgical masks. They were just cloth, went over your face, and they tied on the back. And they're basically there because they wanted to protect the patient or protect the doctor from being sprayed on with bodily fluids, or from him or her spitting on the patient. So clean room and cloth masks do not block airborne viruses. And why don't they? Because the mesh that they created is not tight enough to block those particles. If you were to go look at a cloth mask under a microscope, it would probably look kind of like a chain link fence. Okay, you would see all of the pieces of it, and they would be arranged in a nice pattern. And so I thought it was even more comical to say, if I put two of them there together, that I'm going to make it safer. It probably helps you to some extent. It blocks fluid to some extent, but it is not necessarily going to help you from transmitting a viral infection. All of a sudden now, 2.5 years later, they're coming to believe that. Masks seem to have become a cottage industry of its own. I want to follow the money. I mean, every store you go into has masks all over it. I mean, we can buy masks with football teams on it. We can baseball teams, all different kinds. And then I noticed that that our congressmen are getting KN95 masks. And KN is just an N95 mask with a more stringent fit. And I thought it comical that mostly all of them are made in China. So here we're getting back to our favorite keyboard commando. He said, science is not truth. Science is finding the truth. When science changes its opinion, it didn't lie to you. It learned more. And I want to know who it is. Because science is always moved forward by a particular individual questioning the current standards, methods, and conclusions. It's not done by a whole bunch of people just automatically coming up with this one brilliant idea on one day. Then what you propose, or what anybody else propose, must be testable and never an opinion. You know, there were people at one time that had the opinion that if you sailed out far enough in the ocean, what would happen? Fall off the edge, right? That was an opinion. Now, when we finally did go sail around the world, that's a testable scientific conclusion that the world is round and not you don't fall off the edge. Because most of the time, if you try to base a scientific observation by common sense, you're almost always incorrect. Scientific conclusions should never be based on politics or corrupted by money. You know, one of the reasons why, and it's come to light now, that one of the reasons why so many people didn't challenge the things that were going on was because they were being threatened that their grants for their work would be withheld if they challenged what the politicians were saying, and that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. So some people ask, this is a valid question, and I went to go look it up. Vaccines work to eliminate polio. Why are they not working on the same way for COVID? A good question to ask. Wasn't polio also a viral infection? It was. No question about it. Why did the vast majority of the country line up for vaccinations, and why were there no anti-vaxxers? And that's a good question, and I tried to research as much as I could. Polio is also spread by a virus, but it mainly attacked children, if you go look at it. And the disease was extremely debilitating. You probably have seen pictures, or if you haven't, if you go out and look on a search on it, you'll see pictures of kids in iron lungs to help them breathe, because it would attack the muscles. They weren't able to breathe without it. And if they were a lucky patient, they ended up with some disability. I had a guy on one of my baseball teams that had polio as a child, and he used to drag his right leg because he couldn't. It had no strength. But the most serious cases ended up in death. A lot of people died, and parents were extremely frightened about the whole situation. At that time, we're talking now 30, 40, 50 years ago, the medical profession and trust in doctors and the medical profession was at an all-time high. And lastly, poliovirus did not mutate to the degree where it eliminated or reduced your immunity once you were immune to it. But I think that the idea about the medical profession is very important, because lots of things have happened to reduce your trust in what the medical profession tells you. So COVID, the majority of cases, are not a death sentence. I hear that all the time. Oh my God, if you don't do this, you're going to die. Well, that's not really true. You may be increasing your risk of getting COVID, and you may be increasing your risk of having something terrible happen to you, but you're not going to eliminate it. Vaccines are not 100% effective, particularly this one. So I had COVID in 2020, and it was just a mild case of it. My brother, who was fully vaccinated, ended up getting a case of COVID, but he had a pre-existing condition. He ended up in the hospital for 5.5 weeks on an incubator, and he survived. Pretty tough guy. But this is a risk, not a certainty. Information about side effects of the viral, of taking it, have been withheld, and now they're starting to come out. They're starting to talk about what they are. And they're starting to believe today that cloth masks are not effective in preventing the spread of a virus, and I think that's true. Problem has been extremely politicized. Any of you guys have been alive the last 3 years? I mean, there it was, the prior administration saying, I'm going to develop a vaccine. And how did this Operation Warp Speed develop the vaccine in the amount of time it did? What it did was, it didn't change the amount of time to develop the vaccine. It changed the amount of time it did to test the vaccine by running certain tests and certain studies in parallel as opposed to in serial. But during that period of time, we had these people yelling, oh, it never happened. I'll never take that vaccine. And then all of a sudden, the administration changed, and almost the same people are saying now, oh, you better take it. If you don't take it, you're going to die. It's crazy. So the other part was the funds provided to hospitals have caused the patient numbers to be overreported. They were giving hospitals money for every COVID patient that they had and every COVID patient that died. So no matter what you went in the hospital for, you went in with a broken leg, but you tested positive for COVID, you're a COVID patient. I'll get money, right? It was crazy. And of course, there were threats of eliminating grants in medical groups if you wanted to question the finding. So we've been told to trust the science, while the scientific data, in many cases, have been withheld from us. And I believe confidence in the medical profession has declined for various reasons. Some of them have to do with how doctors act today and what they do today, and how do no harm is no longer considered to be a medical certainty. And the fact that we keep hearing different stories from them without them explaining why they've changed their opinion. And I've lost confidence in my own doctor. I went, initially, I had COVID in 2020. About 2 months after I was better, and both my wife and I tested positive. She was asymptomatic. I got to suffer, all right? But about 2 months later, I went to my doctor, and I said, what, should I take the vaccine? He said, oh, yeah, absolutely. So I did it, right? Now, I'm coming back a year later, and I'm going, wait a minute, or 2 years, a year later, I'm coming back to my doctor, I'm saying, should I take the booster? Because the booster is for the original COVID. Well, but how's it going to help me with the variant? And he said, well, I'm supposed to tell you to take the booster. That's not what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear a medical opinion, not what someone told him to tell me. So where am I today? Shortly after Christmas in 2020, I had COVID. I believe I suffered the variant about a month ago. So I got it, my son got it, and his daughter got it all at the same time. They went and got tested. He tested negative, she tested positive. I'm not sure that any of the tests were realistic. So about a year ago, I took the 2 doses of Moderna, but right now I'm reluctant to take the booster. I'm not saying I'm not going to take it, but I am saying I'm reluctant. And my advice to everybody within the sound of my voice is they should consult with their doctor and other medical professions and read from different sources what people have to say about all of these things. Now, this is a paper that talks about a guy named Dr. Robert Malone. Anybody know who he is? Dr. Malone was the individual who came up with the method of generating the current vaccines. Dr. Malone doesn't believe the vaccine is going to protect you from the variant. You can believe that or not. Doesn't matter. You can, you need to look at all of the different aspects, talk to your medical professionals, and make a decision on what you want to do because you're comfortable with it. Realizing that anything that you do every day, not just this medical stuff, is a risk. You take a risk when you get up in the morning. You take a risk when you drove here from your home. You're going to take a risk when you drive home. Certain things you believe are acceptable risks, you will do all the time. You need to make a decision about what you're going to do with this, with boosters and with masks, and from now on, because you're comfortable with the risk that you are taking. And if you're not comfortable with it, you're just doing it because someone said, oh, you got to do it, well, you're a lemming. And you can go jump off the cliff with everyone else. I personally believe COVID will mutate again. And if it follows the past experience of past virals, like the seasonal flu, every time it mutates, it becomes less deadly. And so I think it's going to just recur every year. Like, see, it might end up being, anybody got their flu shot? I got my flu shot. Anybody got their flu shot this year? Maybe it'll be a part of the flu shot. I don't know. But please, realize that this is a risk-based decision and be comfortable with the risk-based decision that you make.